Welcome back, everyone. We're going to get started. For those of you just joining us, my name is Rachel Hughes, and I am the editor-in-chief of the Tulsa Law Review. And it is my privilege and honor to introduce our distinguished keynote speaker and the person that brings us all together today, Professor Heather Gherkin. After graduating summa cum laude from the University of Michigan Law School, Professor Gherkin served as a law clerk for Judge Stephen Reinhart of the United States Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit and for Justice David H. Souter of the United States Supreme Court. She then worked in private practice in Washington, D.C. before becoming assistant professor at Harvard Law School, where she was granted tenure. Professor Gherkin joined the Yale Law School faculty in 2006, where she has taught advanced topics in election law. Professor Gherkin has written extensively on election law and constitutional law, and she has been published in the Harvard Law Review, Stanford Law Review, and Columbia Law Review, among others. She has served as a commentator on legal controversies in several media outlets, including the New York Times, LA Times, the Boston Globe, NPR, CNN, MSNBC, and NBC News with Tom Brokaw. In addition, Professor Gherkin has testified on election law questions before Congress and the Massachusetts State Legislature, and in 2007 and 2008, she served as a senior advisor to the National Election Protection Team for Obama for America, and she is working for them again during this election year. While Professor Gherkin is considered an election law expert, her recent scholarship exploring issues in federalism and diversity is the reason we are here today. Without further ado, I would like to introduce you to the J. Skelly Wright Professor of Law at Yale Law School and our honored guest, Professor Heather Gherkin.
I can only spend the rest of the day thanking everyone for this wonderful day and wonderful honor. And so I feel like I should start with the College of Law and also the Law Review. It's incredibly kind of you to invite me here. I know I am not your conventional Festschrift person. I would at least like to think I'm too young to be Festschrifted, although every time I look at Ernie, I think we're getting old. And so maybe we really do belong here. But so I know this is sort of a different model to have a younger set of scholars talking about the work, and the work is changing and evolving. But for me, at least, it's been a really incredibly helpful and wonderful discussion, and as great a gift as anyone can get. I also wanted to thank Barbette. I don't know where she. So I have to say, I mean, it is absolutely ridiculous. If you could just clone this woman, it would be. So last night, after I was escorted, after I got a tour of the city from Barbette, who picked me up at the airport, I get into my hotel room, which is giant, and there's this gorgeous box of chocolates, and it's, you know, forget federalism all the way down. It's courtesy all the way down. I mean, every single detail has been taken care of. I also especially want to thank the people who schlepped out here. Tulsa is not on the way to anything. Is in that sense exactly like my hometown of New Haven. And so I want to thank the young people who are here, who took the time to write on this question, the youngish people who are here, who are my colleagues and dear friends, and it's just wonderful to see you on any circumstances. And then, of course, the young at heart, who are always been an honored member of our cohort, no matter which cohort it is. But what has really united the people who you've seen today is that they all do great work, and work I deeply admire. And it is true that I disagree with almost all of it, and vice versa. But it's really incredibly nice to have all of you here and commenting. I must confess, I did not like the first part of any of your speeches. And the only thing that redeemed it was that basically Ernie Young was whispering in my ear, as like the brother that he is. It was like having a pop-up video. You know, so you would say something nice, and then Ernie would say something sarcastic. And that was actually very helpful getting through it. Although as the day wore on and I went from, you know, scholar to queen to God, I became more and more nervous about what I would be doing up here at the end of the day. Ernie actually decided he was going to go call our co-clerks, who used to call me Queen Heather, and I used to call them my subjects. But now I feel like I've grown into a different role. The other thing this is what I've learned is great about one of these things, is that I have spent a lot of time in my career answering really hard questions about my work, and it was so fun to watch you guys answer the hard questions about my work, and to give such elegant synthetic summaries of them. I mean, it was immensely helpful to hear what you took from the work. And that's because, this is one of the things about hitting someone when they're in the earlier part of their career. I'm right in the middle of writing a book that pulls all this work together and adds to it. And so to have a group of scholars as skilled and intelligent as all of you essentially helped me think through these questions. What are the hard questions? What are the intellectual straightaways? It's just been as great a gift as you can ask for when you are working on a book. I know I don't deserve to be up here, but I just would like to say that everything that you've said today makes me hope that one day I will actually earn a Festschrift like this one. So I wasn't quite sure what to say today. Usually for something this important, I would write down a speech, but since I didn't know what everyone was going to say, it's a bit like an Iron Chef competition where you said, and the mystery ingredient is, and here it is. So I thought I'd say a little bit about the work as it's evolved, the parts of it I think that run through the things that run through the arguments, and then a little bit about the problems that I still think exist in the work. And this is actually where I'm actually going to try to outdo you all. I think you weren't nearly hard enough on the critique, and so I'm going to give you a little bit of a harder hitting critique. So first, just on what I think runs through the work, in some ways this work does begin with my identity as an election law scholar first, because election law is a place that's obsessed with power, it's obsessed with institutions, and it's one of the rare places that imagines minority-dominated institutions as being a tool of empowerment. And so what I found as an election law person who suddenly found myself stumbling into the world of constitutional law, and particularly because I began, as Guy did, as thought a lot about race and equality, is when you look into constitutional law, you realize what a bizarre place it is. And in particular, the conventional wisdom that has long existed both in constitutional theory and I think just generally in the academy, that diversity, meaning statistical marrying, is the right way to empower minorities, is a counterintuitive idea when you're a voting rights scholar. Because what you immediately notice about the conventional account about how we should empower racial minorities, which is to put 1 or 2 on every jury or 1 or 2 on every decision-making body, is that it relentlessly reproduces the same numeric inequalities on governance as racial minorities experience elsewhere. And that's kind of a counterintuitive strategy for empowering someone if you're a voting rights scholar, where you imagine that the ability to exercise power, to wield political authority, really matters. And then that's how I ended up, despite my view on states, ending up with the federalism scholars, who I will just say are a deeply weird tribe. Because the federalism scholars are maybe the only other part of public law that believes in minority-dominated institutions. So federalism is a theory that depends on and even glories in the idea that national minorities can sometimes constitute local majorities. And so that's where, I mean, Guy said it exactly as I would. I think that scholars of equality have something to learn from federalism scholars, and I think that federalism scholars have something to learn from scholars of equality, and a lot of my work is in some senses devoted to that question. The second question that just haunts me is the question that almost everyone has raised at some point, but particularly Nita and Ilya raised, which is, what does it mean to exercise power? And here, I will say, this is where the questions that haunt me are also something like a rant. Here, I find it, this is stumbling into the federalism scholars, who I sometimes refer to as the federalism boys, because it is a fairly male-dominated field. The federalism scholars have a dominant conception of what constitutes power. And this is where I'm really going to irritate Ernie. So the first time I sent Ernie one of my articles on federalism, he wrote back, "This gave me a heart attack." And the second time I sent it to him after I'd revised it some, he said it gave him hives. So you see, it's better. I don't see hives. He blushes on occasion, but on my behalf. But federalism is dominated by the idea of sovereignty. The idea that what matters in terms of power is the ability to preside over an empire of your own. And in some ways, I actually think the the people who believe in autonomy as opposed to hard sovereignty, the people who believe in de facto autonomy rather than de jure sovereignty, they have the same idea of power inside their heads. That is, they have an idea of power that means that you are able to preside over your empire, set policy for your own polity. And it's a perfectly sensible idea. There's nothing wrong with the idea, but it isn't the only way to think about power. And in some ways, I think that the place that I feel like I found room to write in federalism is in thinking about power not as being an empire of your own, but as helping administer someone else's empire. The power of the servant, as I call it. And I think that actually there's a ton of power there. And if you ask any administrative law scholar, they would tell you that the power of the servant is really an issue. They call it the principal-agent problem. But I think that one way to think about it is that there are possibilities associated with the principal-agent problem when you're thinking about the question of federalism. So the notion of power that I have in mind is not being the outsider, but being the insider. It's not being able to preside over your own empire and set your own policies. It's the ability to set someone else's policies, but an important somebody else's policy, to be a national policymaker and inside the system. So in some sense, it's autonomy versus embeddedness. And when you think about that, I actually think that this is a mistake that the people on the right side of the constitutional debate also make. So if federalism has this idea of autonomy as the dominant paradigm for thinking about power, in some ways people on the right side also have a fully theorized account of autonomy, but not a fully theorized account of embeddedness or the power of the servant. So just think about the First Amendment. When we think about dissent, we think that the idea is that you're able to speak in an autonomous fashion, that you have a right to speak against the state, and the state can't interfere with it. It's a perfectly sensible idea. But we rarely think about dissent, and I'm going to get to Guy's critique in just a second, but we rarely think about dissenters as being able to wield power inside the system. As Guy said, right, you can't be engaged in dissent if you are wielding actual power. And so again, I think there's this strange way in which lots of parts of constitutional law have accounts of autonomy, be they personal autonomy or institutional autonomy, but they don't have a competing account, which you might call embeddedness or integration or something along those lines. So the only thing I will say about that is that one of the best examples of this is the work on cooperative federalism. So cooperative federalism is the one place where the states are clearly and genuinely embedded in the broader federal system. And what's so interesting about the literature on cooperative federalism up until quite recently is that one, traditional federalism scholars have not written all that much about it, although that has been changing. But two, the people who write about it as cooperative federalism. So they write about it as something that promotes all of the sort of, good housekeeping seal of approval values of federalism. It promotes debate and better decision making and experimentation and so on. It's all the stuff that everyone would agree is a good idea. But what isn't true of the people who write about cooperative federalism is that they don't notice what all the other federalism scholars notice, which is that as much as federalism is about sort of the good housekeeping of democracy, it is also about contestation and identity and resistance. That's the part that we never see when we talk about uncooperative federalism, and I think that's in part because we associate the ability to resist, to dissent, to engage in contestation as something that only can be done from the outside, and that can't be done from the inside, which is why we have a lot of literature on cooperative federalism, but not much on uncooperative federalism. And I particularly, and this is where the rant comes in, when you read much of the literature on cooperative federalism, you just want to, smack these people in the sense that, and this is, no, I'm making Sandy look moderate, but in the sense that they're just going to all hold hands and sing Kumbaya. I mean, it's so nice, everyone's cooperating, and isn't this great that they're working together? I mean, it's fine, but this is what gives me highs. Things work differently in the real world. People actually resist one another and contest things inside and outside the system. And so it's actually more my irritation with the cooperative federalism scholars than my irritation with the autonomy boys that led to a lot of this work, which I just want to say to the younger scholars. One of the things that you learn as you sort of go through a career is that rants are actually very helpful things, that almost everyone, particularly who's a JD only, learns what they think about things by reacting to other people's work. And so you begin with the attack, and then eventually you build the affirmative case. And it's only by reacting to other people's work that you actually get a sense for what you believe. So, for example, dissenting by deciding was drafted all but in its entirety in the back of a big lecture hall at Harvard as Cass Sunstein delivered his lecture on why societies need dissent, his Holmes lecture. And it was a brilliant lecture, and everything that he said was extremely thoughtful and smart, and I disagreed with all of it. And so in the back, I was scribbling out the Dissenting by Deciding article, because what I figured out when I thought about dissent was by listening to Cass and realizing that's not what I thought. The other thing I'll just say about the autonomy question, whether you can be engaged in resistance on the inside versus the outside, is that in some ways, there's this funny law professor impulse to want, when it's talking about the administrative state, to want clean lines of authority, to be against chaos, to think that everything should run smoothly. We have a Weberian idea of the administrative state. And that, again, is a perfectly sensible idea. It's just a little bit of a weird idea when it's applied to our administrative state, which is a Tocquevillian version of the administrative state. So we don't have a clean system where the principal can command the agent and the lines of authority are all clear. We have a Tocquevillian system, which is about as ramshackle and crazy as any you might compare to other places. When you have something like that, when you have a Tocquevillian system rather than a Weberian system, there is room for the kinds of things that I write about. The third thing I think that sort of runs through the work, and this is the part that particularly makes Ernie crazy, is I'm a nationalist who writes about federalism and believes in federalism. And typically, there's sort of two camps in the world. There are the federalism scholars who care about states, and the nationalist scholars who think that states are just about birds and flags. And I'm a nationalist who believes in states in the sense that I think that decentralization is an inherently useful part of keeping a healthy democracy moving. So that leads to sort of a couple positions that I take, which are just different from not everyone, but a good number of people in the field. So the first is, and this goes again to Franita's question about, and to Ilya's question about whether or not it's essential to have sovereignty as part of the system. So Franita and Ilya asked quite properly, so what does it mean if you can engage in dissenting by deciding, but your decisions aren't protected? Because in my view, it is perfectly fine for the national majority to deliver what George Bush would call a good thumping, or what Barack Obama would call a shellacking. So it is perfectly fine, in my view, for the national government to reverse the minorities. That's, to me, a sensible strategy, and I think that for two reasons. So one is, at the end of the day, as much as I believe in centralization, at some level, I think it is actually perfectly acceptable for the polity to dictate policy all the way down. And so if the national polity wants to invest in it sufficiently, it cares about the issue enough, we should have the fight, and we should administer a good thumping to the minorities who are engaged in dissent that we don't agree with. The second thing is, I think it's actually just an essential part of the dialogic piece to it, and this is where Guy, actually everyone, Guy and David were really exactly right. So I am a nationalist who believes in federalism in large part because I think our national democracy doesn't always work particularly well. And if you just sort of look at the frozen tundra of policymaking called Washington, D.C., you realize there are so many issues that never get on the national agenda, and because they matter to people. That is not in spite of the fact that they don't, it's not because they don't matter to people. Things matter to people, and that's exactly why national politicians won't touch them. So immigration is one of those issues, gay rights is one of those issues. The national politicians would much rather allow the states to create their own policy-making enclaves, their red and blue enclaves, and just leave those hard questions to the localities in the states. And I think that it's really important for national decision makers and the national polity to have those debates. And in a conventional democracy, it's very hard to get that stuff on the agenda, because you can speak as much as you want, but if you really want to get something on the agenda, you really need to have power. So one of the metaphors I often use in talking about these issues is when you think about just the conventional dissenter, we think about someone standing up on a soapbox in the middle of a park and saying something. And I just want to ask you, what do you do when you see someone on a soapbox in the middle of the park talking to everyone? You walk on by. And that is exactly what a majority does. Radio silence is the most powerful tool the majority has with regard to dissenters. And the useful thing about dissenting by deciding is that it's able to put stuff on the agenda because it forces the majority to engage. The one thing the majority can't do anymore is just engage in radio silence. They have to decide whether to administer the good thumping, or they have to decide whether to tolerate the difference. I also think, though, that in some ways it makes my life much easier to be a nationalist who believes in federalism, because I never run into the harder questions, which are always inherent in the question of sovereignty, which is, well, what are you going to leave protected? Because in my view, it's fine for the national majority to intervene whenever it likes. So I don't have to engage in the question of what kind of stuff gets protected, what if it's harmful to groups below. And that's particularly important for me because, and this contrasting myself with the First Amendment scholars, it's easy to be in favor of free speech because mostly speech doesn't inflict a lot of concrete harms on individuals. But the moment that you have power, and the moment you exercise the power of the state, is the moment that the costs just go up immensely, which is why it's essential for the national majority to be able to exercise some control over that. Now, that being said, and this is, I've softened on these questions a little bit. So in some ways, the debate that is just running hot and heavy still through federalism scholarship is the debate between the process federalists like Ernie and people who believe in a stronger level of in some level of sovereignty, formal protections enforced by the judiciary. Although, and here's where, I mean, I hate to call you a moderate, Ernie, because you're mostly wrong on virtually everything. But on this question, you know, yeah, I know. But on this question, I actually just think that I don't really have a dog in this fight, because I think that sovereignty and the power of the servant and process federalism, they're all just part of the mix. And in some ways, they are competing with one another, and in some ways, they're complementary to one another. So Ernie's right. By virtue of the fact that you cannot commandeer a state, you give them more power in the negotiating process. And by virtue that the states, as a de facto matter, have traditionally had autonomy and power of a certain area, gives them more power when the national government steps in. So I'm willing to cede a little bit on the sovereignty question, in the sense I don't think it much matters. And that federalism scholars have been spinning their wheels for a very long time for these kinds of questions, which is also one of Ernie's points. So I'm willing to soften it a little bit, but when the rubber hits the road, I'm a nationalist. And I think administering a good thumping is not such a bad idea. So that's the summary of the themes. I'll just say a little bit of the word of the critique, because you guys were so much nicer to me than you should have been. So let me just say a couple things about the articles in which you were commenting. Two of which were written before I got tenure in a desperate effort to try to get tenure. So they're a mess. They're filled with jargon, they're badly written, they're overly footnoted. I cite all kinds of stupid people who I shouldn't cite because I felt like they might review my tenure file, and so I should cite them, whereas now I only cite people who I think are good. In some ways, they're informed as much by a sensibility as a set of substantive arguments. So a sensibility is not a methodology. A sensibility and instinct is not a methodology, and so they're not as rigorous as they should be. There were literatures I just hadn't read when I wrote them. So David was complaining I wasn't citing him. Now, David had not started writing yet. I think you were still a twinkle in George Mason's eye at that point. But nonetheless, I hadn't read those literatures thoroughly enough to absorb those lessons. I'm just better at it now. I also didn't really understand what the project was when I started. So Fernita was sort of talking about, when you were talking about electoral districts and juries, there was a moment when Dean Larry Kramer, at a giant meeting of a bunch of people in public law, said in front of everyone the year I was up for tenure, about a month before my tenure vote, you know this second order diversity article? No one cares about juries. Electoral districts are stupid, and you shouldn't write this, or you shouldn't publish this article. Now, that's a little bit of a problem when your tenure file is about to close, and that's one of the big pieces in it. But in some senses, when I began this project, I didn't know what it was about. I didn't understand its relationship to the federalism literature. I had an instinct that there was something to say, but I had no idea how to say it. And in some ways, the book is my effort at redemption, which is to really think about how I should say it now that I feel like I understand how the work fits together. And one of the perfect examples is what Guy said was the utterly unsatisfying response, and what constitutes a dissenter. And can you really be a dissenter with power? And I think that now that I'm a sly old academic fox, I just refuse to answer the question. That is, that I'm not sure how much rides on whether we call them dissenters or roses or whatever we want to call them. I just want to make space for us to talk about this. And the decision to evoke the word dissent is more an effort to sort of cloak these guys in the sort of legitimate frame of dissent, which is, we love dissenters in the United States. They're the underdogs. It was more of a rhetorical flourish than it really was a conceptual term. And so you can call them what you will. And I can still insist that they matter. But I didn't answer that correctly at the time. And there are a million of other questions I didn't answer correctly. One of them being, what pushes it? So this is a question that David put on the table so what is it that drives dissenters to do this? And I do have an answer for David. I don't think it really matters much that party identity runs up and that nationally people are voting based on national parties at the local level. And I don't believe in Ernie's completely lovely, but I think slightly atmospheric idea that states have identities. That's because I'm from Connecticut, which, as far as I can tell, has no identity whatsoever, doesn't even know if it's a Red Sox nation or Yankees fans. I mean, it's really a pathetic and boring state. So why is it, what is it that pushes these things? I actually think that it's interest groups. So I understand these institutions, and this is again something where the federalism scholars really hate this stuff. I just understand these institutions as institutions through which we run a pluralist system of interest groups who are in competition with one another. And the way I understand the advantage of these groups is they let some interest groups, and this is where, Guy framed it beautifully, it's the constant losers get a chance to control at the local level. And for that reason, they're important and that they matter, because these are groups that don't get to take their turn deciding at the national level. So if you think about it as interest groups, that also helps me answer the Susan Rose Ackerman question. Because if they're interest groups who really care about setting national policy, and that's why they're pushing it, right? They're building a movement like the gay rights group have been doing, like the environmental groups have been doing, like those who want to bring more religion into the school have been doing. Those groups are all working at the local level with an aim to a national debate. And so their motivations are actually quite different, I think, from the usual motivations of sort of your average everyday policymaker. And so I think that's what drives and motivates the project. The third question that I never have an answer to, and I've decided to give up on it, is what is the optimal level? So Ilya raised this question. So what is the optimal level of decentralization on my account? So Ilya wants me to keep pushing it further and further along. And I think Sandy does not. Sandy wants me to pull back on this question, but it's actually, I don't have an answer to this question, and I'm never going to have an answer to this question, because I don't actually think it's possible to answer this question. So Cass Sunstein was asked at this Holmes lecture how much dissent is a good idea, and he said, asking about how much dissent there ought to be is like saying how much music should there be. There is no answer, and that's as weaselly an answer as I know of, and yet it seems like as good an answer as there is. So instead, I'm just going to answer it by saying an attack. No one else has a measure either. So that's one of the things I really love about federalism scholarship is there's an inordinate amount of discussion about what the right picture of the world is. And so federalism scholars often will tell you the states are losing power and they don't have enough power, and nationalist scholars are just the opposite story. No one has a magic measuring stick, and we muddle through. And I think that all we can do is muddle through. That is, all we can do is give a convincing picture of the world, and to note the judges ought to pay attention to both of those pictures as long as they're plausible ones, and thinking about how to treat states and localities. So I've given up on that project, but I don't regret it a bit. And since no one else has ever answered that question, I don't feel so bad that I'm not going to do it. Finally, and again, David raised this question, Ernie raised this question. In fact, David and Ernie's work in particular has been influential in making me think this question. The one thing I've never done, and which is the one surprise for me today, was the assumption that you all think that I think decentralization is a good idea, which I actually haven't really committed to in some senses in any of my articles. So if you read them carefully, and this is the pre-tenure panic thing, I never say that we should have more decentralization, we have the right amount of decentralization. It's not just the magic measuring stick. What I say in each of those things is, each of my pieces is, here's a set of values that we don't discuss enough. So when we talk about federalism, we have a list of the things that matter. There's laboratories of democracy, there's all sorts of reasons why we care about states, and in localism we do the same thing. And then we put them on a scale and we balance them. And the only thing I've committed to as a normative matter in my pieces is to say that the values that I'm describing ought to be on the scale. But I don't actually talk about how you should weigh them in any given situation. I don't actually ever say, it was good to do it here and bad to do it here. I just don't say that in my pieces. And the reason I don't say it in my pieces, and that's because I don't think I'm any better suited than anyone in this room to make that evaluation. That is why I feel like I've had something to say about what goes on the scale. I don't have much of an argument about how to balance it that would be any more or less convincing to you than anything else. I'm not a philosopher, so I don't have the sort of toolkit to bring these questions to the fore, and I've really struggled with it. So I wrote a whole chapter on civil disobedience for the book, and I've discarded it because it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't fit particularly well. It wasn't an analytic. There's some things that were right about that literature and useful in that literature, but there was a lot that just didn't fit. And so here's where David and Ernie have been really helpful to me. Their work has, which is I finally, in the book, I am actually writing a chapter on my normative take. So when is it appropriate to engage in descending by citing, and when isn't it? And the basic argument is that we have a loyal opposition in this country, and that that's the right way to think about the groups that I'm talking about. So the notion of a loyal opposition is a foreign notion in the United States for the most part. Lots of other countries have formal institutions by which they allow the loyal opposition to take part in the project of governance, but we just don't have one. We have two competing parties, but we don't have a notion of a loyal opposition. And so if you talk to any political theorists, they'll say there's no such thing as a loyal opposition in the United States. I actually think we do have a loyal opposition, and it's embedded top to bottom in our decentralized system. And if you think about that question about what it is appropriate for a loyal opposition to do, then I think you can actually get some traction on these questions that's far less abstract than a philosopher would give you, that raises the right kinds of questions that the civil disobedience literature doesn't raise. But if you imagine, and it's also, to me, a useful frame for me because it's an institutional frame and a political frame and one that involves power. So if you think about when is it that the loyal opposition should act and when shouldn't it act, I think it helps you sort out when is it should you engage in dissenting by citing and when shouldn't you, and under what circumstances. And it's not to say that the answers are easy, but I think it actually gives you traction on how to think about whether the questions, whether dissenting by citing is appropriate or not. So I feel, again, I just wanted to say thank you again to all of you, but I'm, again, much more interested in I've been thinking about these questions for a long time. Unlike David, I'm a hermit. I'm on a year-long research leave, and I spend every day home by myself writing, and they are the happiest days. I'm sort of startled when my children come home and think that I should talk to them. So I spend a lot of time cogitating about these questions on my own, and I'm much more interested in what you have to say about them. So with that, I think I'd like to open it up for questions. Thank you very much.
I think you just said a couple of things that maybe at least in a little bit of tension with each other. One hand, you said you're a nationalist. I think ultimately the national majority should override. Then later you said you don't have a position on sort of what the optimal level of state autonomy and decentralization is. So if the second is your ultimate position, and maybe your take is not that I'm a nationalist, but rather that I'm not sure to what extent I'm a nationalist, what extent I'm a federalist, all I have is a theory of what things should be on the scale, right? And if that's your ultimate answer, then, well, it's possible that ultimately the right amount of protected state autonomy will be zero. I think it's relatively unlikely, especially given that much of your work seems to be devoted to saying we've undervalued the part of the side of the scale towards greater decentralization. I think there was at least a little bit of a tension there. I wonder if you maybe could address it.
Yeah, when I say that I'm a nationalist who believes in federalism, I don't mean in the sense that I think that conventionally nationalist means you just think everything should be done at the national level. What I mean is that the benefits of federalism should be accounted for in national terms, which is why I'm so interested in all the parts of it that involve making national democracy work better. So that is true. I think actually some arguments about federalism are like that. Laboratories of democracy, for example, is like that. The idea that states should be engaged in contestation. But a lot of the arguments about federalism is about the importance, just of the inherent importance of bringing things down to the local level, bringing things closer to the people, local autonomy, and so on. And those arguments don't move me in the slightest. It's not that they're perfectly plausible, but I want to think in national terms about why we should care about states and localities. And I think that conventionally the argument sort of in the reverse direction, that is people begin by thinking, how should we think about, begin by protecting the states rather than the national interest. I think I begin with a reverse presumption. So it isn't I think you can be a nationalist and still think decentralization is a good idea. That's the only point that I want to make.
So then you could be a nationalist but still have a protected sphere of local autonomy where the
You could.
nation ties its own hands and chooses not to intervene in certain areas.
Yes, you
as
could.
a
You could
matter
absolutely do
of
that. We do
rules
that.
and not as a
We do
matter
that
of
with regard to rights, right? We could do. We certainly could do that, and that there wouldn't be anything inconsistent with that. It's just I'm far more skeptical about the values associated with sovereignty, the possibilities that it can actually exist in the real world in our light of our highly integrated system, and also I do think the national government should be able to trump when it needs to, but it could decide to tie its own hands, and or hold back when it doesn't have to.
So I want to press a little bit on the answer you gave about that it's really that you're not worried about nationalized institutions or the problem of externalities because they're interest groups at the local level. It's not about interest groups. The problem I have with that is that the power of interest groups doesn't necessarily come from their numerical majority. In fact, usually it doesn't, right? So that the power comes from their ease of organization, kind of Menker-Olson senses of how powerful they get. It may come from the fact of their ability to generate resources completely outside of jurisdictions. So why are you confident at all that in subnational jurisdictions, different interest groups will win? So,
yeah.
or enough, or anything. So, like in an example, oil companies are rich. We can say that. They're also relatively easily organized. There aren't that many of them. You have to make an assumption that they're not going to be equally powerful in states where there's lots of oil, middle oil, and little oil. We can say that they'll probably be less powerful in states because they may have less ability to draw on resources or less ability to bring in coalition partners. But they're going to have some degree of power because they can do lobbying, donations, they're easy to organize, whereas gas consumers may be hard to, so something like that, consumers will be hard, even if they're a majority everywhere. So why are you confident that we get the interest group competition rather than electoral competition, which we could see where majorities and minority changes in the population or preferences of voters, we could see how the tables are turned? Why are you confident that interest group competition will work in the same way?
Yeah, so I guess I'd say two things. It has to be as compared to what. So rather than comparing interest group against interest group at the local level, I just compared what interest groups are going to succeed at the national level. And I just think there are some that consistently can't make it up to the national level. And I think so I begin with the idea that from zero, there's more room at the bottom. I also think, and this is where I'm not sure, the electoral accountability argument, I'm not making that argument, but it is true, now Ernie's going to jump in. I'm between the Scylla and the Charybdis here. But it is true that, there are some interest groups that are more likely to flourish in some places and not others. And that may be because of elections, it may be because of culture, it may just because of the big sort. That who it is, it could be professional, it could be the networks that people are engaged in. So there are just some networks that thrive in some places and don't thrive at others. So, for example, there's a reason why, even though San Franciscans are not majority gay, but there's a reason why that special interest group did better in San Francisco than it's doing in other places.
Push back a little bit. There should still be losers. So in the sense that there are groups that should be national outs and local outs always.
Yes,
so
that's right. I don't solve that problem.
Disaggregated group, you're not going to get it. What? The poor, or consumers. You could do it any way you want.
Yeah.
Which are not likely to win at any level of government because their ability to organize is always going to be low.
Yes. So I think that's right. And that there are. Yeah, right. That is completely right. But those groups are not groups that so I don't have a solution for them. The nationalists don't. No one has a solution for them. So I think it's fine to say that there are groups that are going to fall outside the ambit of these protections. It isn't a claim that all groups do better. It's a claim that particular groups can do better because of decentralization. So it's not if you can figure out how to solve the problem of the diffuse poor not having voting power, then the next best shift is yours. Sandy?
Yeah, I think you and Ilya are quite literally talking past one another because, I think the key word you used, which I'm very sympathetic with, is decentralization, which is basically a political concept. One of the most decentralized countries in the world today is China, though one would never confuse China with being a federal system. Ilya keeps talking about, and Ernie would talk about federalism meaning entrenched guarantees. And what I hear you saying, and I agree with you almost completely, is that who really cares about the entrenched guarantees? But it can often be very useful and attractive to have decentralization, subsidiarity, and whatever, but there's no particular reason, there's no reason at all for courts to believe that they're empowered to enforce something called our federalism. Whereas Ilya and Ernie, I think, both think, well, that's, of course what courts should be doing. And, and that, to that extent, you're just a dangerous nationalist because you want, completely deferential courts, which is fine with me.
So what I should just say by way of background, for those of you who aren't junkies, that there was a big debate prompted by these two guys who wrote, what was the first article titled?
Notes on a National Neurosis.
Notes on a National Neurosis. Yes, yes, feeling Ruben. But Notes on a National Neurosis is the name of it, and they also have something called Puppy. No, you have Puppy Federalism.
No, they have Puppy.
They have Puppy Federalism.
Yeah, which is Puppy scholarship.
Puppy Federalism. So these guys basically are kind of the bomb throwers in federalism. And a while back, they wrote an article saying it turns out that American federalism is not a federal system. And the reason why it's not a federal system is it doesn't have any meaningful sort of protections of sovereignty, which is what most people, that's the basic argument. And the thing that I just find so bewildering as someone who I was late to that party, is why anyone was fighting about this at all. So I'm happily concede that under that definition of federalism, the United States is not a federal system. So I'm definitively talking about American federalism, which I do think is best understood as decentralization. That's exactly right. This is another thing. David, really, you were so kind to me. There is nothing comparative in it. In any of this work, partially because I think you shouldn't do comparative law without a license, but really, it's completely under theory. Yeah, it's very hard to do. When I talk about federalism, I mean our federalism in the sense of American federalism. So here's where I'll just, I don't think we need hard limits for the states and localities. I actually think that, but I do think that when we still have this problem, which is in adjudicating all kinds of questions and thinking about questions like preemption and commandeering, judges have a picture in their head about how federal-state relations are supposed to work, and I want to talk to them about what the picture in their head should be and how they should imagine it. So I feel like I am talking to judges a little bit in the sense that I want to I want to inform the doctrine, but I don't want them to do what Ilya and sometimes Ernie does, although Ernie softened on this question too as he's aged, about whether or not they need to be hard limits. Ernie.
So I think you actually do care about federalism as opposed to decentralization, because the thing that Billy Rubin acknowledged very quickly in passing and then forget all about is that there's not one but two differences between decentralization and federalism.
Exactly, I know what you're going to say.
And the second one is
power
independent
centers.
electoral
Yes,
base.
exactly. I believe that point entirely. So this is where we're an old married couple. I was an old married couple with Ernie before I was with my husband. Right. So this is where Ernie is Ernie is exactly right. It matters that these groups come from different power bases.
You're recording this, right? So Ernie is exactly right.
Especially the part where I got referred to as God. So different power bases matter a lot, and it's not just different power bases. It's also sort of different forms of institutions. So some of them are involve expertise. Some of them are just pure democratic institutions like juries, where it's the layman. Some of them are a combination of politics and expertise. States, state bureaucracies are actually run by governors as political agents as you can get. So all of that, that's where I agree with Ernie. I should have added that. All right, now Ernie, how's that?
That's good.
Now, do you want to ask a question? I interrupted.
The other thing that they wrong is that entrenchment is not an either or. There's a lot of different levels of entrenchment, so it may matter a very, very big deal whether something can only be changed by a new act of Congress as opposed to a new regulation from, say, the Justice Department and the right to die case. And so once you realize that there's like 15 different levels of entrenchment, then this whole distinction breaks down entirely. The only other thing I wanted to point out was I'm a much bigger nationalist than you. If you recall our first fight ever, which was whether we would keep the American flag hanging in the chambers in our office at the court, which one of us wanted to take it down? So I think things like...
I found it somewhat intimidating.
You wanted to put up a dirty picture from some modern artist.
It wasn't the flag from Connecticut, was it?
Even the notion that the states are necessary as a check on the federal government, that is itself a national value, right?
That's right.
And important in nationalist terms.
Yeah, no, I think that this is where I think all of the arguments regarding contestation are really arguments about how a democracy should function, which is a nationalist cause. And so, and in some way, this is where if there's a divide in federalism, the people who pay attention to that stuff are the people who don't talk almost at all about cooperative federalism. So they sort of look at cooperative federalism and think that's not federalism. And that's a mistake on their part. And similarly, the people who write about cooperative federalism are in the happy-go-lucky world where things are cooperative. And so they're not thinking about these sort of questions of power and contestation. And so in some ways, there's a little bit, I'm engaged in a lot of intellectual arbitrage, right? Borrowing the insights of one part of the field to apply to the other.
Under Ernie's notion, France is a federal system. That is, French mayors are very important figures. They're elected by local constituencies. That's where Jacques Chirac originally came from. And in England, I think, there are also mayors and local consuls. And I agree with you that it is very important to have plural electoral systems, but that's not what we usually mean by our federalism, capital O, capital F.
Second order the same way theirs are to a large degree, which makes the independent things less independent.
But the whole point of the federalism decentralization distinction for Feely and Rubin is that it is a policy choice made by the center and that can be retracted at will. And to the extent that, you're just demonstrating that that never exists anywhere. So, far from showing that federalism doesn't exist, I think effectively decentralization doesn't exist in the sense that they mean it. The whole thing is a lot more complicated than that argument is ever going to acknowledge. And maybe before we write articles with titles that accuse our opponents of being neurotic, we should take those complications into account.
I mean, Ernie is neurotic, but it's not fair to accuse him in a title. But I would actually just think of it as a sliding scale, right? That there's a broad range. But even in the sort of modestly Weberian bureaucracies that we have in this country, like administration of Social Security, disability, there's actually a tremendous amount of variation among the states, even though it's a witless exercise according to the rules, right? It's just supposed to be a very straightforward thing, and yet we still see variation. So the street level bureaucrat, the rebellion of the street level bureaucrat is not confined to the street in any system. Ilya?
I've actually written a good deal about the Feely and Rubin stuff, and I think as a conceptual matter, your point is correct. You can have a system of discretionary decentralization that potentially achieves any benefits that a federal system with reserved autonomy can achieve, but that's also kind of like saying you can have a benevolent dictator that effectively achieves all the public interest benefits that democracy might achieve. The dictator genuinely cares about the people, gathers information about what's good for them, and so forth. The question, of course, is what are the actual incentives the dictator will actually do that? And I think I would say the same thing about decentralization versus federalism. And I think your point about dissenting by deciding is that precisely you want the dissenter to decide, at least in some of those situations where their preferences conflict with those in a national majority. If you're the same as those in a national majority, it may not matter whether they get to dissent by deciding or not. And it's precisely in that situation where the incentives conflict with each other that some kind of reserved power, or reserved domain of federalism is precisely what you want if you value decentralization in that area. You may not. You may say, or I may not even say, I would say, if you're dissenting over the issue of slavery, I don't care, right? We'll just suppress your desire to practice slavery. But if there's a set of issues where you want to allow dissent despite the contrary preference of the national majority or the national governor or whatnot, then that's where I think Feely and Rubin's argument is at its weakest.
Yeah, here's just where I think that the world just works differently in practice. And so I think that in our system, because it's so heavily reliant on a decentralized system of administration, that the formal guarantees of sovereignty are not really where the game is. That the game is the power that local people have by virtue of the fact that they're there, and the federal government can't reproduce that bureaucracy by itself. And so I think the power of the servant is far more powerful than I think a typical federalism scholar does. So it's where I align myself with the ad law people. So administrative law is occupied with one question almost, which is the principal agent problem, and thinking about how to solve that problem. And the difference between me and the administrative law scholars is I don't think it's always a problem. That is, I think there's all sorts of possibilities associated with the principal agent problem. But I think it's time to heed the lesson of administrative law, which is there's an immense amount of power that you get by virtue of the fact that you're implementing the system. And so that's where I want to push back. Is that I think that's That's where, and as I look across our own system, if you just sort of think about where the world is going, there are not many places where where the majority is ever going to cede formal guarantees to the states or localities. It's not really clear how much it would matter, but it is clear that we're an increasingly integrated system with the federal government starting to regulate it everywhere concurrently, as Ernie pointed out. And so there, I think that's where the power of the servant is really going to matter. And I believe it's a genuine power.
But don't you think the independent electoral fact that state officials come from somewhere, that is one of the formal guarantees of sovereignty?
Oh, I see. So do I think if the federal government decides to abolish states? Yeah. Actually, I'm not sure if I'm actually going to concede that. Here's what I'll say. As long as there are, I could imagine a national system with locally elected officials, so that you still get the power base point, but they're not necessarily state. I think that would work too. So now we've gotten a sigh.
Only if it was never used.
Yeah, but that's just, I'm not sure, since I don't think about states as having an identity. For me, all I care about is concentrated interest groups, which are concentrated sometimes regionally, sometimes locally, sometimes in states. It doesn't really much matter for my system as long as there's a different power base. And the different power base could be achieved by having just a disaggregated system. You wouldn't have to have a formally separate government giving them power.
I don't want to belabor this, but without the formal guarantee of sovereignty, the moment the Obama administration decides that those Texas bureaucrats are too beholden to the oil companies, it fires them. And then where is dissenting versus fighting?
Well, this is so you have to have them accountable to a different group. I'm willing to agree with that.
I think that's a formal aspect.
Yeah, maybe not.
Where Ernie's argument, I think, breaks down is that he ought to be more sympathetic to Austinites who are the victims of the tyranny from the state legislature.
Most of my friends are Austinites. Victims.
Right. But still, I mean, what we have is this picture of states when you talk about federalism, whereas one of the really valuable things about Heather's work is that at the end of the day, you're not all that focused on states. You're focused on low-level bureaucrats or on school boards and the like. And the question is whether, those people like yourself who believe in our federalism do believe or ought to believe in some very robust theory of home rule with a capital H and a capital R that most states, in fact, don't grant their localities. And then, if the most robust notion would be to say, well, they really do have to. So the first thing you have to do is to overrule Pittsburgh versus Hunter, 1907 decision that held that a suburb of Pittsburgh had no right not to be commandeered and forced into, it's the opposite of the secession problem. They were just brought into Pittsburgh against their will, and I gather that's a fundamental decision in American state law, that they can annex whoever they want and there's no constitutional protection against them. So what do you think of that?
But I hate to tell you, Gerald has one. We only have time for one last question, Ernie. I'm cutting you off because Gerald wants to jump.
They were going to take their times off there.
No, God has spoken.
No, I mean, bad things happen. Resetting is exactly right. In Austin, Austin's referred to, despite what Ernie may tell you, as Texas adjacent, right? As opposed to being actually part of Texas, right? Because we're constantly being
Tyrannized,
right? by the state legislature. But you take something like California, right, where you have local water districts, right? Normally, you would assume that the state power could force local water districts to do one thing or another, when in fact the California Supreme Court said, well, we don't think so, right? There's no supremacy clause here exactly for this particular resource. And so it allows localities to have alternative power bases, as it were, that are tied to what gives them authority and to resist the state.
This is is all very nice, but I don't teach at Yale, so I have a hard time pulling this out of the Constitution.
I'll just note that Ernie Young is the author of The Constitution Outside the Constitution. I think
In
there's
the Yale Law Journal.
there is time for one more question.
It's the unwritten Constitution.
Guy.
All right, so Heather, your view, let's turn to your view of dissenters. Because you have a view of dissenters as you laid out as sort of the lone person, the crazy person on the soapbox. I have a view of dissenters as the students who occupy the office of the principal, all right? So yes, you're right, you can walk by the crazy person on the soapbox, but you can't walk by the person who occupies your office. And so I wonder to what extent the contrasts that you draw are really driven by the views of the individual, of what you think dissent is. Because in my view, when you occupy that office, you are exercising power.
Yeah.
Right? You're not going to be ignored. You're acting, and so to then say, the categories don't matter. Well, maybe they do, maybe they don't, but maybe it depends on what your views are.
Yeah, so I'll just say two things about that. I actually think they're not dissenters, they're civil disobedience. And civil disobedience is essentially, this is why I first turned to that literature, because it is this funny category where it's not dissent in the conventional sense that we think about people speaking, because they are exercising power. I mean, that was Martin Luther King's point. When everyone writes about civil disobedience, they note that those engaged in it are engaged in an exercise of power of a sort. They're not wielding the power of the state. So they don't have the kind of coercive power, the same level of coercive power that the state does. So, for example, they can occupy the principal's office until the police come and toss them into jail, but they can't toss the principal into jail.
What about the judge on the 3-judge panel who threatens to write a dissent, right? So let's take that as, how would you classify that person who the threat itself matters if you care about unanimity or if you care about the airing of dirty laundry or et cetera? It seems to me then, all right, so it seems to me that
can you just say one more word about the judge writing a dissent? You think is not a dissenter or is a dissenter?
Oh, is a dissenter, right? Who is a dissenter? So you have a multi-member court, and someone who says, look, if I don't get my way on this, or if you don't modify this, then I lose.
Yeah.
That has to be a classical understanding of what dissent is. But that person wields power under given basic understandings. If you value unanimity, as an example, then clearly the dissent, literal, the dissentor, wields quite a bit of power.
Yeah, so this is actually where this is about the borrowing from the spheres question, which is, I think, exactly right. You can't borrow from one sphere to another, although in some ways, I'm talking about the sphere of governance. In the sphere of governance, the judge who's writing the dissent is not exercising state power because he's not writing the order. When he wants to write the actual wield state power, he has to bargain away and moderate his position. So it's not his position anymore, right? It's the position of
It's also not the majority's position.
It's not the majority's position. No, that's right. Interest group bargaining, and I think that is fairly outside of the ambit of what we would call dissent. So he might be a dissenter, but in that moment, he is not dissenting, right? I think that's how I would understand it. And so similarly on the governance question gets so complicated. There's this great example that Bickel has, which is the Freedom Riders. So when the Freedom Riders went down into the South, we understood them to be dissenters in the colloquial sense because they were riding into the South and doing something that no one there wanted. They were enforcing national law. So who was the dissenter there and who wasn't the dissenter there? In some senses, you could sort of leverage it up and down as you move from sphere to sphere. And so what I want to do is embrace the colloquial sense of it, because I want to cloak these folks in the flag as the loyal opposition. If there were a term, I'd flip it that way, which is why dissenting by deciding came up, because it's not dissenting and it's not deciding. It's both at the same time, and it's one of the world's ugliest terms, but I've never come up with a better one. And a steak dinner to anyone who comes up with a better one. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.